I live in Alaska. That probably puts a pretty clear image in your head of what I deal with inside the wilderness. It's a long list, but many of the dangers are things unlikely to be encountered. But some of them are just a given. Wolves, sometimes. But it's the bears we all really look out for. A lot of the predators out there are smarter than we give them credit for. But bears don't give a shit. They want to push the boundaries, test the limits, and sometimes even just piss you off. It's like dealing with a dog that can take your head clean off. I was stalked by a bear for a couple of miles while hunting deer. It was mid-September. It was probably 40 degrees. This is important too because bears can operate better at different temperatures. Too hot and they become lazy. Too cold and things become too much work for them. They don't want to be put in the chase. That Goldilocks zone, between 30 and 60 degrees. And that bear might tail you for 2 or 3 miles just to see if you make a mistake. It's a truly haunting experience. The weather wasn't extreme, but that's one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me that I can at least recall out there. I'd recently watched Revenant with Leonardo DiCaprio. I was with my son, so I was a little on edge already. And then this bear comes out of nowhere. The Revenant aside, we've all heard of the infamous Grizzly Man. Tim Treadwell was a bear enthusiast, known for his seasonal treks into the Alaskan bush, wherein he would live alongside groups of grizzlies. He was mercilessly eaten alive over the course of an hour or two in the fall of 2003. Something many of the outdoorsmen whisper about around a campfire up here. It's a worse fear for a lot of us, truly a fate worse than death. We were walking down a game trail, and the brush was so thick, and the bear was barely 20 feet in front of us, and you couldn't even see it, but you could hear it and smell it. This is a signature for the area up here. You can almost always tell there's a bear near you before even seeing it. The smell is a huge indicator, but also the stillness. A forest will just go dead silent, as will a stream, a glen, or really anything. It's an energy nothing trifles with. I'm walking up the trail. Everything in front of us was shaking. Then all of a sudden, everything stopped. The only thing that I could hear was the bear breathing and the sound of my own heartbeat. I handed my son the .44 mag and loaded around into my rifle. I told him to run if we were attacked. We started to back up slowly and it took a step. Because of deep-rooted fear of bear encounters, many outdoorsmen up here carry a heavy sidearm. The rifle itself is good, but it's only one big bullet before you have to rechamber a shell with the bolt. Having a semi-automatic pistol enables you to squeeze the trigger 6, 7, maybe even 10 times, depending on the caliber. It's also quicker barrel correction for moving targets. It's also a quicker draw. It just makes sense for danger encounters where the hunter no longer has the upper hand. Leo DiCaprio in The Revenant would have been just fine had he carried a 10mm over that muzzle-loading musket. Such is life. I started to yell at it, and it stopped dead in its tracks, which surprised and relieved us both. We've both heard stories. You're supposed to yell and try to scare them off. But there's lots of stories where that stuff doesn't flat out work. When I saw it hesitate, I wasted no time. We stepped off the game trail and started bushwhacking down the hill. It began to follow us, and when I started to hear it getting closer, I would turn around and yell. It was better than dumping a couple of rounds in this thing for it to scuffle off, and then have to deal with the wounds somewhere else. Call me stupid, but I respect wildlife. I'm not trying to kill or maim anything I can't get home and eat myself. It followed us for like maybe 2 miles. It was never more than 50 or 60 feet behind us, just trudging along, investigating. Only once did I swing around and put a bead on it with my rifle. That breathing got aggressive for a second, and it sounded like it was thrashing toward us. We made eye contact for a brief second through the gap of my sights, and it took careful steps back into the foliage. It was a scary experience, but having my son with me opened up a whole new world of fear. All I could think about was one of us having to watch the other get eaten, completely incapacitated from the fight. But fortunately, for both of us, it got bored and thankfully left us alone. This story ended up being a lot longer than I originally anticipated, and I apologize for the long read. I will say that in all the years I've told this story, people usually respond like this. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So I hope you take the time to enjoy it. This story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon, was acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hunting, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hunting were secondary to the thrills of walking to the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week of living in my parents' house. The movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail right after graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes and black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. I was stalking quail and grouse, two of my favorite birds to hunt. Also, two of the easiest to get a permit for in a state that you don't live in. Bird hunting satisfied me in the sense that you get all the good stuff. Hiking, tracking, spotting, stalking. But you don't have to deal with the dead weight at the end. Everything you clip weighs under a pound, so it's easy to bring 10 or 15 home to clean. It also limits what you need to carry in terms of a firearm. For birds, all you really need is a single shot 20 gauge, which is exactly what I was using. It's a small caliber, but it's still a shotgun, enough to leave someone feeling at least a little protected. Somewhere in the national forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail, only to be startled by two people sitting on a rock, dressed nearly in all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple that kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. What struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun. Their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru hikers abandon personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and just simply watched me as I passed. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not really knowing what to say. I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night, like I always did, following bare precautions. I hung the leftover food that I'd cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed that the food wasn't there. I immediately thought that a bear had to have entered my campsite, so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite, 2 pairs of them. One of those prints led right up the rope which the food was hanging. I thought back to the couple that I passed earlier, and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured that couple was just simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than food. Several more days passed. My mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of any intruders, animals or otherwise. I woke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife and that 20 gauge. Situational awareness is beyond important in encounters like this. There isn't any cell phone service. There isn't any help coming. If you hunt or hike alone, you have to be careful. You have to take every precaution and be prepared to adapt to some potentially f***ed up situations. Animals and people in the woods are unpredictable, so you need to know what your options are and what you're capable of inside these moments. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise is much more likely to be an animal than a person. Then I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from, but in the dark, surrounded by trees, 100 miles from the nearest city, it plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out to claim that I had a gun, but instead decided to remain silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard the footsteps circling my tent. I was ready to slash and shoot whatever opened it. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lay frozen awake in my tent until sunrise. I opened up my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence that something actually happened were boot prints, same as before. It's super ominous to find fresh boot prints that don't belong to you. I didn't need any more encouragement to completely abandon that area and move on to another. This was a serious cross-country trip for me though. I was planning on hiking and bird hunting for the better part of 100 miles through various types of California terrain. Several more days passed. I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail, being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line. I could see the trail winding for miles in front and behind me. I stopped for water in the rear shade and noticed there were two hikers miles behind me. All I could see were two white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said out loud, This trip is over. The reason being that I could literally see these people in those weird white clothes. Who the hell wears white on a rugged cross-country hike? I'll tell you who. A complete psychopath. They were like machines, steadily gaining on my position, no matter the terrain. They never looked up once, eyes glued to the dirt as they followed the trail I left behind. They were outdoorsmen, trackers at the very least. I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Costella, located off I-5. The only problem was, it was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and then decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got inside my tent, tried to get sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours inside my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of any other sound. I knew they were close, but wasn't sure how close. All I could think was, this is so messed up. God damn. Finally, a flashlight hits my tent. It lights up the entire thing, and then goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the darkness. It was sort of like that cliche scene in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them, and then the camera pans around the trees, because the people have no idea which direction the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running toward the tent, and barely made out a figure, moving inside my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into multiple trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got under that tree trunk and lie still. I saw that flashlight moving around in the distance. I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain that they were gone now, but I still didn't move. Eventually birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would soon follow. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail. I abandoned my campsite, and I walked the rest of the distance to Costella, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke to the police and Forest Reserve. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove down from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and Forest Service months later, who told me that there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forest. However, there have been no other reports of the terrorizing that I experienced. As far as I know, nothing else ever came of the couple. I grew up in a hunting and archery family. We own the largest indoor archery range in the United States, and my father is a 3-time world champion, and my uncle is Butch Johnson, Olympic gold medalist. Anyone in this hobby makes it a lifestyle. They live it, breathe it, and would die for it. A family friend of a high reputation in the archery world, told us the story that he experienced while hunting, and since then has never entered the woods again. Again, I come from a long line of legendary archers, not just daytime sportsters, but people who have built their entire livelihood on skill and reputation. These are people with something to lose. What I'm saying is they aren't going to gossip about some bullshit when they know better. So back to this family friend. The story happened back when he was still hunting. He sticks mostly to indoor tournaments now, but he was known to bag 'em and tag 'em back in the day. Deer, elk, you name it. He killed it with a bow and a single arrow. He's in his tree stand alone, staring out into the woods in a small field, about 50 to 60 yards away. A doe has now walked out of the woods to graze on the grass. He raises his compound bow. He takes aim. But then from the other end of the field comes, and this is what he described it as, a large ape-like creature, close to 8 feet tall, just booking it on 2 legs toward this doe. For the story, we'll say it's Bigfoot, but I'm going to tell you now that none of us actually believe that to be true. So this Bigfoot runs up to the deer, and before it even knows what's happening, it gets picked up from under one arm, under the deer's belly, and continues a full sprint into the woods at the other end of the field. The deer is screaming bloody murder as it's carried away by this unknown creature. Our friend is there, bow still drawn, shaking in shock, questioning everything he knows about the land. The animal life there, he's used to hunting, everything. He'd been hunting this area for 25 or 30 years at that point in his career. He's a true stalker in the sense that he's in the place hours before the sun comes up, long before any prey is in motion. He's silent. He doesn't wear anything that carries a smell. He was a phantom up in that tree, and nothing knew he was there. The man was certain death up until this point. He refused to get down for the longest time, until it started getting dark, and he didn't want to be alone at night after seeing that. He gets out of the stand, left over $5,000 worth of equipment up there, and sprinted back to his truck. We actually went back out with him to help collect it all. And that's when we knew something truly strange had happened. Who would leave all that out there overnight? Only a person who's truly afraid. He stands by his claim and has never, not once, returned to hunting or the woods after being now in his mid-50s and spent his whole life around it. This is what sealed the deal for us. Someone we'd hunted with for nearly decades literally will never hunt again. The guy won't even hike or fish anymore. He doesn't think it was an actual Bigfoot, but the reality of not knowing what it was keeps him out of that woodland. Seeing it move at that speed, at that size, without making a single noise. As hunters, we can tell you it's impossible. When you're 8 feet tall, or other things can usually hear you breathing. That's how you stalk a moose in the bush. Sometimes there's a curtain of birch, and you have to lead the animal blindly, using only when it's huffing and walking as a guide, until it turns the cover, because when you're that big, every step is loud as hell. This creature didn't make any of those sounds, not even when it was at a full sprint. No breathing, no crunching leaves, just a simple thud through the earth that he actually felt more than he heard. After seeing it move like that, he shared a little bit with us, that it'd be easy for a person of any size to disappear with a creature that can move like that. Every hiker and hunter that comes up missing probably reminds him of that day. This is always the one that disturbs others the most for whatever reason. A quick background. I grew up in the forest, inside this tiny house in the Appalachian Mountains. Our house was more like a shack, and behind it was a large looming mountain. The nearest neighbors weren't far, but with the woods in between it, it sure did seem like it. My parents were in a band and left once or twice a week from about 5 p.m. to 2 a.m. to practice or go to a show. I was around 12. My sister was 6 or 7. We would pass the time by watching some old VHS tapes or just talking. One night my parents left and a torrential downpour started. If you know Tennessee, you know that a flood can happen at any time. I've had several pets drown from just being outside. We had a small closed-in porch in which my mom's favorite dog, Whiskers, was tied via 20-foot chain wrapped around this toolbox. It wasn't the most effective or even considerate method of retention, but it served its purpose. We were poor. Whiskers was doofy and about as useless as a guard toad, but he had a loud bark, and my parents' hope was that he would frighten intruders on sight. He was sleeping quietly on the closed-in porch until the wind came, which at the time was a complete roar. It caused the front door to come out from its hinges. Whiskers bolted off into the night. I yelled at my sister, "I'm gonna go get him," put on my dad's rubber mining boots and ran out. I didn't get a flashlight because, I don't know, I was a dumb kid. I was terrified for his safety, especially in the rain, and the fact that if my parents found out that their dog was missing, I would have had the shit beaten out of me. Lightning lit up the side yard, just enough for me to see him bolting down the bank and across the stream in the backyard toward the mountain. I ran after him. The creek had a quote-unquote bridge, which was just a very thin wooden plank. I didn't even touch it, but leapt over it. My adrenaline was sky high. Now the lightning was gone, and I could only hear Whiskers based on the dragging sound that his chain was making. Maybe 30-40 seconds, and I was already soaked with rain, not a dry spot on my entire body. So I ran up into the forest. I lost the sound of Whiskers. I was in a panic at this point, with the rain and a lost dog, and so I numbly just scaled the slippery leaves as I ran. I called out. I made kissy noises as you do for a dog when you're 12. Then out of nowhere, it seemed like a shadow fell. I don't really know how to describe it. I couldn't see anything, but the black suddenly got blacker. And then I quickly realized something else. I could smell extra well, thanks to the rain. It really made things pungent. I smelled dead leaves. I smelled wet dog. And I smelled dog urine, which was not surprising. I actually got hopeful at that point, because I knew he would be out trotting around, marking his territory, and maybe, just maybe, I could find him. But the extra black just seemed ominous. I stopped calling or whistling. I felt anxious, like something else was in this forest with me. That's the exact feeling I got, and I stopped to listen. Living so close to Appalachia, you hear a lot of legends about what goes bump in the night, especially around here. We got it all from goatmen to feral people, inbred ghouls and wendigos, backpacking serial killers, you name it. We got it all. I don't know what I was listening for, but it was just something more than my dog. A whistle, a voice, someone calling my name. My mind was racing with all the different myths that I'd heard over the years. I couldn't hear anything, but from above me, the crest of the mountain, I smelled something. It smelled putrid, rotten, like a carcass that had been sitting in the southern Tennessee heat all day long. I remember almost gagging, and my anxiety turned into true actual fear. I knew how bears smelled, and how most animals smelled actually. This was not something organic in an alive sense. It was a rot that smelled older than time, ageless, the decaying body of something that hadn't walked the earth in a very long time. I still couldn't hear any footsteps, but I got the sense that something was moving toward me. It was kind of like a vertigo, if that makes any sense. My body was not wanting to stay still at that point. I was frozen in terror, staring out into nothing, smelling rot, and feeling like I was being stalked. I've been stalked by a mountain lion before. It felt almost exactly the same, except with an extra dose of piss-your-pants fear. Then add the torrential rain, and I could hardly breathe out there, too awestruck to even move. The lightning flashed again. I saw something impossible. The trees were lit up around me, but several feet in front of me there was a huge black void. It was a pure, pitch black. In my peripheral, I could see really far around me, but in front, it was just like someone had sharpied the entire forest out. Right then, I heard a dog barking, and Whiskers sort of appeared out of nowhere from my right, insanely barking and heading towards that dark spot. The lightning went as fast as it came, and my only thought was, now it sees us. Somehow I had the sense to dive down and pick up Whiskers, and grab the long chain before he got too far. I had to yank him away. Keep in mind it's still raining loud as holy fuck. So loud that I'm sure nobody else heard him barking. But me, I was standing next to him, and I heard this guttural noise from the top of the mountain. It was more like a growl, and more like a rumble, almost an earthquake sound. It was deep, and all my wet hair stood completely on end. I remember taking off, and I thought I'd have to drag the damn dog all the way down the hill, but he seemed to agree with my decision. I have no clue to this day, and one of the biggest mysteries is how we got through all of that forest without slamming into any trees. Black vision, downhill at a 70-degree angle, with slippery leaves. We were like superheroes there for a second. Superheroes who would probably have pissed our pants if we looked behind us. It was also incredible to me that in my dad's big clunky boots, I was able to keep pace with a running dog. But that's how frightened we really were. It was nothing but true animal instinct. We crossed that bridge, and I ran across it this time, hearing my footsteps thunk loudly and thinking to myself, oh man, that was loud, as though we were being chased. We get back into the house. I chain the dog up. He's wet, shivering, and looking very remorseful for his bad decision. I scrambled into the house, getting a hammer and fixing up the door the best I could. It was a shack, like I said, so our lock was a piece of wood and a nail in the middle. I changed into some warmer clothes and sat back down, too scared to even say much. My sister was tired and quiet. It was late. She wanted me to put on a movie, but I stopped her. I still felt uneasy. We put the lights off. Trust me, it was far less frightening this way, because if the lights were on and it's pitch black outside, anyone can be watching you. So we sat in the dark living room and looked out the picture window at our rainy yard. We still didn't see anything, but there were flickers of shadows. Something was off. When the lightning appeared, there would be a mass either far or near that didn't light up just right. I took a flashlight and shined it out the window, and the same thing, it just ended. The beam was cut off, swallowed up by black spots. Whiskers usually was the type of dog to bark his head off at the mere sight of a butterfly, but he was now dead quiet. Our roosters all over the property though, we had at least 200, were all crowing. I remember that I had this superstition book when I was a younger kid, and inside that book it said if a rooster crowed at night, death was near, as in physical manifestation, medieval death. Since my dad was a cockfighter and a rooster expert, I asked him, but this was years before this incident, I asked him what a rooster crowing at night meant. His reply was almost as chilling. It means something is walking through them. If they were crowing and he was awake, he'd go out with his gun and almost always bring back a mink or a weasel or a snake. So roosters seem to have a pretty good alarm system. This night, when it was darker than dark, and the rain was pouring down in sheets, you could hear them all crowing and crowing constantly. I said nothing to my sister, and she didn't know what the crowing meant. My sister ended up falling asleep, and I stayed awake, staring out that window until my parents finally arrived home, complaining of the wet dog smell, and shooing me away to go sleep somewhere else. They asked me what happened. I told them in about 3 words that Whiskers got loose, and I caught him quickly. They saw the door and luckily didn't blame me for that. They blamed the storm. I thought that was the end of it, but there was one more thing. The next day, my dad was very pissed off, yelling about hooligans wandering around in the rain. He also has a pretty bad case of paranoia. He thinks people are always out to get to him. I went out to see what had happened, feeling that whatever it was probably due to the storm and not any kind of people. But he was angry because of that bridge. The long flat panel of wood was completely busted and splintered into pieces. Maybe a person could have smashed it. Maybe, if they weighed 450 pounds. But the amount of splintered wood and gnawed edges seemed like it was from a sledgehammer or a freakishly large beaver with anger issues. I never had the stomach to tell him what I saw that night, because there was no way I could ever prove it. He was already a basket case, with some serious paranoia. I figured laying out the idea of a skulking dark evil entity coming out of the mountain probably wasn't a good move. Weird things continued to happen on that property for as long as we lived there, but I never saw that void ever again. And that's probably for the best. My buddy and I went hunting over a long weekend just a few years ago. We hiked into our hunting terrain and stayed inside a tent. We were in the middle of nowhere, inside the Norwegian wilderness, and we had exclusive hunting rights to that area, so we really didn't expect any other people to be there. No cell service within something like a 6-kilometer radius, and then another 10 kilometers back to our cars. It was isolating and breathtaking just to be out there. Relaxing is an understatement. We were camped next to a small lake and didn't see any other people there for the first couple of days. It was liberating to be that deep, to not hear so much as an engine throughout the day. The tasks that we had throughout the day were whatever we chose to do: fishing, bird hunting, as well as other small game, and stalking elusive red deer. It was a catch-all that satisfied any urge that we might have. This also meant that we had a good assortment of equipment, including some shotguns, a few long rifles, and a pair of small caliber pistols for execution, knives, and axes for wood cutting. We were almost like a small army out there. On our last night, we were eating dinner next to our campfire. It was pretty late, so everything outside our immediate surroundings was completely pitch black. Suddenly, we heard someone take a shot on the other side of the lake, with what sounded like a rifle. We thought it was a bit strange since there shouldn't have been any other hunters anywhere close by, but we just figured someone was messing around further away than what it sounded like. We quickly forgot about it and settled back in to eat. After another 5 to 10 minutes, someone then took a second shot, which sounded like it came much closer to us. This time the bullet hit some rocks literally right next to us, 5 meters or so. We both froze for a few seconds while looking at one another, and then just ran to our tent to pick up our shotguns. We then ran quite a ways into the woods and just hunkered down. After a few minutes, we heard another shot, and we were both pretty positive that that one hit our tent, which later turned out to be correct. We obviously had no idea of what to do. We couldn't call the cops since there was no cell service. It was completely dark. We couldn't really hike out of there without using our flashlights. It seemed like a terrible idea. So we ended up finding a down tree with a little cave-like thing under the roots. We just sat there until morning. It was like being in a foxhole or something. I just sat there for hours, replaying that visual of the bullet striking those rocks just near our feet. If the shooter had pulled the barrel up an inch, that bullet would have buried itself inside my leg or my chest. I had phantom pains littering the places I thought would hurt the most. All the while, I'm waiting for more gunfire to start splintering the logs above me. It reminded me of the trench combat in the First Great War. We packed up as quickly as possible and basically ran back to our cars where we called the police. It seemed like the cops took it pretty seriously, but nothing ever came out of it from that investigation. Still have no idea what happened to this day, or who could have possibly done it. There is absolutely no reason for anyone else to be out there with a gun, unless they were poachers, which is almost unheard of in Norway. I've literally never been so scared in my life, and it definitely took a few years before we ever went back. Pig hunting in the bush in the Jenolan, New South Wales in Australia. I'm sure you're at least somewhat familiar with the term bush, so I won't go too far into the logistics. It's incredibly isolated, no quick back way to anywhere, and there isn't any shade or water for shit. Everything is angry, poisonous, covered in spikies, and just plain wanting to kill you. Saltwater alligators are some of the most notorious, but almost anything can kill an unsuspecting outdoorsman out here. Kangaroo, koala bears, snakes, and lizards, and the list is nearly endless. It's afternoon at this point. We'd already been creeping through the bush for a couple of hours. No shots taken yet. But we'd come across a lot of fresh tracks and droppings, so we knew there was something nearby. In a single file lane, we zigzag near a waterway to help cover the sound of our footsteps. That's when I feel a tap on my shoulder. I turn and my mate is pointing out the bobbing shapes of a pair of wild pigs. They look decent size, high energy, just trucking along near the brush. We fall in line and start to stalk them along the river. The pigs stop every few meters, start destroying the riverbank, rooting around, kicking up dirt and pissing everywhere. These pigs are pretty toxic to the environment out here, and hunters don't think twice about dragging their mangy little carcasses back to their camp. It keeps the terrain intact for at least next season. So anyway, we're downwind and totally still, about 30 meters away in the brush, about to take our shots with our 308s, when the two pigs absolutely piss bolt away. We'd been tracking them for 20 minutes at this point, and none of this bolty behavior presented itself the entire time. Whatever had scared them really had made them jump, because there's zero chance of us following them or even catching up. We stand up and shake our heads, with no clue to what scared them away. I've never seen a pig go from zero to full flight without a gunshot at least first. We look and check the embankment, nothing. No snakes, no crocs in the shallows, no big birds of prey. We start to look around for hikers, or maybe there's other hunters on the far side of the creek. Anything to explain that sudden getaway. Still nothing. We're pretty buggered at this point, decide to pack it in. It was a defeating day, but we'd seen sign of plenty of through traffic. There'd be no shortage of shots to take throughout that weekend. As you know, Australia is hot, but the bush is blistering. You can't carry on for more than a few hours without rest and water, especially hucking around your equipment. Our hunting sessions were about 5-hour stretches in the morning, until about noon. On this first day, when we did most of our scouting, we started a little later so the sunset is starting to creep in. Just as we're walking back through some pretty thick pine forest, maybe 100 meters away from the bank where we'd lost those pigs, we both hear a growl. I start to turn around, but I hesitate, because part of me has no clue what I just heard. My mate plants his feet, shoulders his rifle, and just waits for movement, like some kind of war hero. I swear to God it sounded like a lion from an African movie. There's nothing in the Australian bush that makes that kind of sound. Nothing at all. There are larger than average kangaroos, and the occasional pack of dingoes, but they can't growl like this thing did. They don't have that kind of mass. I've never felt fear like I did in that moment in my entire life. Then I quickly realize, no bird song nearby, and we're pretty damn close to the evening chorus time. So we're standing for 5 minutes with our rifles out in the falling light. There's still no birds. Now we finally decide to head back to the fire trail, where I parked my ute at. It's a 30-minute walk in the dust. Our rifles are out, and we're both jumping every time we hear anything. I still don't know what that sound was, but I will never forget how primally afraid it made us, like evolution had programmed us to shit our underpants when hearing it. I have not hunted in that area since, and that was back in 2006. My mate went back a time or two, but never found anything. No weird tracks, no massacred animals, and no more growling sounds. Just another thing trying to kill us in the outback. I was a young hunter when this happened. It was just my second time out, sitting in a tree stand with my uncle, who'd been hunting his entire life. My dad worked a pretty demanding white-collar job and lost touch with that side of his upbringing, so he just shipped me off with his brother to instill some core values. To paint you a picture, our stand was near the bottom left of this acre of land. We had 2 acres visible, one in front of us and the other to our right, which was mostly visible from the tree stand. There are channels of thick woodland that frame these acreages, and we've got a perfect vantage point of multiple tree lines. The flatness also gives us that advantage in the chase. Hunters can lose track of their prey after the animal panics and bolts in whatever direction seems best. This can include up or down hillsides, through extremely thick foliage, or even off a cliff. If the shot is too far and the terrain is too treacherous to navigate quickly, the animal will escape and can't always be located. It sucks, but it's just the reality of what can happen out here. I was 2 or 3 hours in, waiting for some deer to show up, We heard a lot of different animals, from turkeys and foxes and all kinds of birds, and plenty of squirrels. Some of them even wandered by our tree stand, or even along the branches beside us. I was a city kid, so it was all quite amazing to my sheltered psyche. Eventually, at the opposite end of the acre, a small deer came out of the tree line. I had my gun ready, just in case, but my uncle signaled me to let it go. He explained to me later that it would be even an extremely hard shot for him to make. Also, the deer was still fairly small, maybe only a year old. So I just watched this cute deer munch away on the ground and wag its little tail for a few minutes. He told me it's likely his family was nearby. They would all wander into the clearing sooner or later. They might even use the yearling to push into the field as some sort of safety test. Let the little one poke around and see if anything comes after it. Again, just another harsh reality. It's run or be eaten for a lot of these critters. My uncle and I shared a smile. I was so surprised that our tree stand really worked, and then, bam! Out of nowhere, a bear lunges from the brush, absolutely annihilates this young deer. Dead instantly. Its jaw wrapped around the neck and shoulders, totally immobilizing the deer. Claws render flesh so deep in the scramble that we can see some of the gore, even from the long shot distance that we have. It pulls it back into the brush. All that motion and power took less than 3 seconds. I was in absolute awe. Even replaying it now in my head, I still just think to myself, what the hell? I was shocked, terrified, and excited all in the same time. My uncle, though, had the classic look of fear, probably because I was so young and he was there with him, but it was jarring regardless. He knew a bit more than I did, though. He knew bears could climb trees almost faster than they could run. They liked climbing too, and we were apparently in prime country for such an encounter. The bear pulled in the deer in the underbrush, and we looked down below and realized we weren't that high up. Not only are bears extremely rare in my area, but the fact that this one was huge and was patrolling around and hiding unseen and unheard of to either of us was just completely mind-boggling. I think about 30 minutes later, my uncle decided it was time for us to leave. We get down, pack up our gear, and head for the truck. He starts it up, and I'm walking around the back taking my sweet time. I stretched and let the sun hit my face and the cool air into my lungs. I don't remember exactly why, but my eyes were just fixated in on one area, as if my brain knew it was seeing something, but I wasn't fully processing it yet. Suddenly, the mood in the air changed, and the cool air felt now dull. I actually started to sweat. I could sense something was wrong. I started to turn around and walk to the passenger door, but I couldn't take my eyes off this part of the tree line. Just before I got in, that same bear poked its head out from behind the brush. It was far away, but I could tell its mouth was covered in blood. It just stared. I closed the door and continued to look at it from the back window of the truck. My uncle noticed and looked as well. This time we were both just flat out scared. I've never seen or heard anything like that since, but it was a good lesson in understanding that you need to be alert and on your toes when in that kind of situation, 100% of the time. That bear was like a ghost, but hundreds of pounds and bloodthirsty. My dad used to fish with this traditional method of using many rods made of bamboo, placed 5 yards next to each other. The bait are usually live tiny frogs, and it's for catching a specific cat-like predator. Anyway, it's always done at night, and considering the method, he had to walk back and forth on the riverbank to keep checking the fishing rods. It's not so unlike how ice fishermen practice their craft. I learned this many years later in a documentary. Ice fishermen will bore their holes in a yard or 5 feet apart to evenly space their baits along the bottom of a lake or river. This ensures the fish to have ample room to snatch the food and don't find it suspicious in any way. These little guys are more clever than we give them credit for. It was when I went along on one of these fishing trips where I got a memory worth remembering for as long as I can live. I was sitting on the riverbank next to our motorcycle, munching on snacks that I brought from home. My dad was around 70 or so yards away, doing another round of checking the rods. Suddenly, I heard my dad running toward me, and I swear I've never felt or seen such terror in someone's face, especially my father. I heard his footfalls and instantly knew something was wrong. I hesitated to look up from what I was eating because I knew it had to be him, barreling right at me. What was I gonna see behind him? Was he gonna be hurt, covered in blood? I didn't know what the hell to expect. He told me to hurry up and hop on the bike, telling me that we're going home. I was like, what about the fishing rods? But all he did was fire up the motorcycle and speed us away. Honestly, I didn't really think much of it. I was a kid who really didn't enjoy anything in which I had to wait, and the night fishing trip was just not something I really enjoyed. So as much as I want to care, I was just happy to go home early. My dad did collect the rods in the morning though. It was also a huge relief not to have to deal with any of it. All those fears that cropped up in my brain turned out to be nothing, and I was just content to leave it that way. As the week went on, I thought of it less and less until I really didn't care at all. But I never forgot though. I never forgot about that weird night where Dad got spooked though. It wasn't until 6 or maybe 7 years later in high school when my dad asked me to join him on another fishing trip. I asked my dad what actually happened that particular night. He got shaky and weird. A look of disbelief came across his face, almost like he couldn't believe that I remembered that. According to him, basically from where he was standing that night, up ahead the river, there was a curve to the right. The water cuts away, and there's this little wall of trees and brush that kind of creates this curtain along the bank. He had heard a little splashing in the water, meaning he caught a fish. When he went closer, he saw a long-haired woman in a white robe squatting next to the fishing rod with her back to him. Thinking that someone is stealing his catch, he asked her what she's doing. He announced this in a stern way, as my father is a no-nonsense type of guy. She slowly stood up, rotating her body to the left to face him, only there was nothing for what was supposed to be a face. It's not like her face is shadowed, but with a distinguished structure of eyes and such. It's blank as the night, like nothing to be seen. My dad froze up, and that's when she said, "Go home." That was when he fled. He said it was certain it was some kind of water spirit of some kind, and he was encouraging it to get back in the water, and also explaining that he would leave. He said it was a ward of some protection against whatever he thought he was seeing. The only time I saw terror on his face is when he was looking for my mom and I in the bedrooms during a massive earthquake in '06. My mom and I were already outside. We saw him and thought, why didn't he come outside? He was in a panic looking for us in every room. My dad was a teacher. He always had jokes up his sleeves, even voted as the funniest teacher in his school years ago. But I know for sure when he's bullshitting me and when he's being serious. He's seen and heard some weird things in his life, some of which he's told me. He said that he reacted the way he did because a part of him wanted to get the hell out, obviously, and a part of him was too afraid that it was a bad omen or something might happen to our family. But thankfully, all he lost was nothing more than a few fish. He never saw that woman again and still fishes that same river to this day. He's probably in fact right there right now. I was out elk hunting with my dad. While we were glassing over one canyon, we saw a bear down at the bottom. It never gave me a shot, but it was the biggest black bear I've ever seen. Still not as big as a respectable grizzly, but plenty big enough to slice up yours truly here. It ambled around the canyon floor for a while, always perfectly keeping up a tree or rock between me and the shot that I needed, until it went out of sight. Well, we were obviously tempted to go after it, but ended up not doing so, looking for elk. Several hours later, we see a decent elk on the other side of the canyon. I shot it. We start down our side of the canyon and realize that it's way steeper than we thought. My dad damn near slid right off into a pair of rattlesnakes at one point. It takes us about 10 minutes to get down, a few minutes to cross the bottom, and then another 20 to get back up to where that elk was on the other side. As we're cleaning it out, we realize it's getting pretty late, and by the time we're done and starting back towards camp, the sun is now setting. We hit the bottom of the canyon and start walking across. Then we hear something big walking through the bushes a little ways away. It's at this point that we realize our predicament. We are completely in the dark, in the middle of a large bear's territory, carrying almost 100 pounds of raw meat, possibly with the bear getting pretty damn close to us. We start up the other side of the canyon as fast as we can, which is not easy because it's still so damn steep. Plus, we couldn't find where we first came down, so we had to push up through brush that was taller than us. It took us almost an hour to get up. The whole time we kept hearing something in the bushes following us, along with some very bear-like breathing at some points. We hit the top and start walking as fast as we could towards camp, absolutely exhausted, still hearing whatever it was behind us while we were unable to see shit. We get to camp. My dad turned on this super bright LED lantern that we had. We were able to see that the bear was less than 50 yards away, staring at us. It followed us all the way back up to camp. He wasn't threatening, just curious. I didn't have a bear tag, so I didn't shoot it, but it definitely scared the shit out of me. We tied the meat up in a tree, keeping an eye on that bear, and stayed up for another half hour until it finally left. And at that point, we couldn't take it anymore. We crawled into the tent and crashed from sheer terror and exhaustion. We got up the next morning, looked around, and couldn't find any sign of him, other than those tracks he left where he'd seen him. We were very happy to pack up and leave after that. The next season, we had a pretty crazy story as well. Some cross-country hiker had been attacked and eaten by a bear out of the exact area that we had our encounter. It's not hard to wonder if that was that same bear that tailed us, now with more experience with stalking humans, and really got the jump on that guy. Almost like the bear practiced its technique on us or something. It's probably not the case, but who knows? Fish and Game never found that bear, at least last I heard. I had just hung a tree stand from a new tree in a new location, and I decided to hunt it that evening. It was just after Christmas, and I was getting a little stir crazy. I get there around 3:30 p.m. and sit till about 6. That's when it gets pitch black out. I then decide to climb down and head back to the cabin. As I'm climbing down, I started to hear coyotes howling and getting ready to go hunting for themselves. This isn't really a big deal. Coyotes are cowards, nothing but little packs of dogs. They aren't going to get close to a grown man, right? And if they do, a single boot to the head is all the encouragement they'll need to get away. You'd have to be hurt or starving for them to get to you. I start walking back for a minute or two, and that's when I hear something behind me. The only light I had was a dim little clip-on bulb attached to my hat. It was completely useless, only serving to light up the path before me. It didn't really reach out more than 4 feet, more a bubble to illuminate a space in front of my face. So anyway, I turned my sad little light on the trees beside me. I saw 5 sets of eyes watching me in the trees, probably 7 to 8 feet away. Well, that's not good. I remember unslinging my rifle, but realized how outgunned I really was. I'd get 1 round off and start to pull the bolt, and the other 6 would be on me. It'd be better to use it as a club, so I just strong gripped it and started backing my way through the trees, keeping my eyes on them the entire time. It was a pack of coyotes. They were literally stalking me. How did I know this? Because when I started backing away, the eyes lowered and started creeping slowly towards me. I managed to load my rifle. I started yelling, making noise to scare them away, but none of them ran. They just sat there, watching me. As I watched them approach, a couple of coyotes slunk off to either direction to flank me. I began backing up faster, moving my head all around, screaming, trying to keep them away. I felt phantom nips at my ankles, thought about how hard it'd be to make it back if they started my legs and then tore out all my muscles. There's also another issue. I have this massive scope on my rifle. I couldn't see through it in the dark, so unless they came right up to me, I couldn't shoot. So instead, I just made lots of noise and continued backing away slowly until I was a good distance from the pack. Then I began running in the pitch black to get back to the cabin. Again, if they became a real threat, I could hip or shoulder fire, maybe tag them inside 7 yards. I just didn't feel confident inside that outcome. They seemed set on making a meal out of my sweaty ass. I huffed another half a mile through the trees until I broke into a clearing. My truck's there, the cabin, and a humming little porch light welcoming me back. I get maybe 15 feet into the clearing. I turn back around and shoulder my rifle, ready just in case they make one last-ditch effort. I didn't know what to expect. All I knew is that I made it this far. They didn't come out, but I could hear them barking and yipping just beyond my sight. In the frenzy, coyotes sound like they're giggling, laughing. It's some creepy shit. It's unnerving. I stumbled into the cabin and locked up for the night. I keep a sidearm at all times in the woods now, and I know better than to fuck with the coyote.